rage, money, power, and big, 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 big.
What's up, players? Oz the Wiz here, and welcome to my channel. If you're new here, please like, comment, and subscribe. I've been playing a lot of First Descendant lately, and I must say it's not really my type of game. And typically I would never pick this type of game up. I'm not really into games like Destiny or Outriders. I tried them, but yeah, I just really couldn't get into the gameplay loop and how long these games go on for. But the First Descendant, what brought me in was the aesthetics. And, I've noticed that, as far as Eastern devs go, they still understand very, very well, how games, or they have not lost the art of making video games, which is first and foremost decide on a target market. Once you know who your target market is, then you build a game around that target market. And this has worked for Nintendo for decades and decades. And it's worked for Sony up until, I would say, recently, where they understood who their target demographic was, and they'll build a game around that target demographic. So specifically, I want to focus on, how aesthetics are important when it comes to marketing or selling your game to an appropriate audience. Something that I think, up and coming Korean developers understand very well. Hence the success of games like The First Descendant, Stellar Blade, and on mobile, Nikkei, Goddess of Victory. Even, if you extend this to the Japanese developers, games like Genshin Impact on mobile, and then of course Capcom's games. If you look at all the protagonists, you look at aesthetically how they design their characters, everything is still built in that old mold that, if it's sexy, it will sell. All their characters look like supermodels. I'm not just talking about the female characters, I'm talking about the male characters. I mean, look at Leon, in the most recent Resident Evil 4 game. You look at the previous iterations of Chris Kennedy, ultra buff, he looks like a superhero, because that's what generally the target demographic, which is largely a male demographic, and that's not changed, are looking for in their video games. The East understands this, and the East is stuck to this. And, for the longest time, I've leaned more into Western games than I did Eastern games because they tend to have better narratives and better stories. But recently, there's been a trend of bigger games foregoing that, trying really, really hard to pivot for stories that are more, I'll say, gritty. Also stories that have a lot of aesthetic, ugliness. And what I mean aesthetic ugliness is that the whole theme of the game is not meant to be visually appealing to, say, the demographic that plays the game. And I don't know, if you can do that continuously without people sort of getting put off. But we'll see. We'll see where that works out. But if I look at some recent releases, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and how those have been received, I think people are sort of catching on that this is almost a deliberate thing to remove sexiness from Western games, to make sure that Western games aesthetically avoid by all means the male gaze, which has become such a big thing now. And this, of course, is not just in gaming. Like most things in Western entertainment, it starts with your movies, your big budget blockbusters, and then it sort of translates or trickles down to other related mediums. Ironically, though, music has gone the opposite direction. Music, I would say, is more salacious now and more sexy than it's ever been. Especially if you look at popular genres like hip hop. I think there it reflects what we see on social media, what we see on Instagram, what we see on Twitter, which is a lot of young women who are marketing themselves primarily as very sexy. Whether it's all the OnlyFans models that pop up on your feed whenever you post something, or whenever a popular post is out, you will see 20 posts from them marketing their OnlyFans sites. And then if you look at Instagram, it was a photo or an image app that was meant for photographers and travel etc. And it's largely become a platform where it hosts a lot of female models, selling, or marketing, themselves and their pages, for more racy content. And that's fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And conventional feminism, in terms of like when I was growing up, was pro that a woman can do whatever she wants with her body. She can express herself, in any way that she wants. However, in gaming and in mainstream, entertainment, there's been a huge sort of like pullback from that. And I would say it's because of the amount of activists that have become involved in gaming, as well as some of the people that made games in the 90s, them now having kids, and having grown kids, and maybe feeling a little bad because they had so much racy content in their games, or in their whether it's games, whether it's movies, TV. And I just feel that's an unnecessary overcorrection. Just because you now have grown up and you now have kids doesn't mean that that market still doesn't exist. You can still make sexy, responsible content. A good example of that is, take a game like, Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2, the characters look like supermodels, but it doesn't make the game less appealing as a survival horror. Not everything has to be in the ilk of Last of Us 2, where it's ultra gritty, ultra violent, and it just makes you uncomfortable all the way through, and there's absolutely nothing aesthetically appealing to, the conventional customer in that. Not everything has to be like that. I loved The Last of Us 1. I thought Ellie was one of the, very well written character. I wasn't even I wasn't that big on Jewel. I actually enjoyed the Ellie sections, which is why I don't like Last of Us 2, because of how they sort of vilified her character. So yeah, there is a lot of room, I believe, still in the West for sexy content, and I believe that the developers that double down on that or double back on that are the ones that are going to have the next big blockbusters. We saw that with Space Marine, by sort of going back to that same dude pro aesthetic that we had in the 360 era, where you had like overly big buff dudes, like with huge guns and rockets and fighting monsters, hordes and hordes of monsters. That was like back in the 360 era. That was like the staple. That was like what everybody was sort of into, and of course it was overexposed. I get it, and so we had to move back on it. But the sort of like detour that they took with the Gears 4 and Gears 5 put off a lot of the original fans. And I feel with a lot of franchises they've done that. Personally, for me, Mortal Kombat has been the biggest disappointment. Didn't hate Mortal Kombat 11's aesthetic, it was okay. Totally hated Mortal Kombat 1's aesthetic, because again, it feels like they've toned down everything on the aesthetic side in terms of like, how sexy the characters look. However, the violence has been toned down to 20, which to me then again raises the question, so what's worse, violence or sexiness? Sexiness is not harmful, like, but violence, ripping someone's spine out, that's things that you potentially don't want kids to see. And again, going back to, my point about, audiences, is, if you're Nintendo, you understand who your market is. That is why Mario is adorable. That is why Donkey Kong is adorable. Yoshi's adorable. All their characters are super adorable, and even the games are made in such a way that they appeal to that primary demographic. Everybody can still appreciate them, but that's the primary demographic. And with games that we grew up with, and this is especially the Sega and the PlayStation era, everything was ultra cool, whatever cool was defined as during that time period. But a lot of it had to do with the games also having a little bit of raciness and a little bit of sexiness in there. That was, went past and parcel. And they've removed that completely from the games, as if that market doesn't exist anymore. As if someone will get offended because, someone, God forbid, someone show cleavage in a game. That's a big no-no nowadays. Every female has to look like the woman you would run into at your local grocery store. or at your local, office park. And I just don't think that is a profitable direction for a gaming business, especially considering how expensive games have become to make today. More than ever, today you need to narrow down your target market. You need to know exactly who's going to buy this. This is why so many devs are having so many problems, is because they have this idea that there's this billion players somewhere there up in the sky, because of the fact that they look at the statistics that come back that include mobile gaming in it, and they say, oh geez, look at that, 40 to about 50 something percent of those are women, which is false. That is not true. You do not have 40% plus female gamers within the console space that buy most of the type of games that these devs are trying to make. I don't believe that's the case. I think if you look at those numbers, you will still see that a large majority of that is still males, late teens, all the way up to your 30s to your 40s. All those people are still the guys that are going to be, that will, shell out $60 to go buy a game. Modern gamers typically don't buy games. They like free to play games. Free to play games like your Fortnite, your Roblox, those type of things. That's what modern gamers are into. The people that you're trying to sell these big budget $70 games want that sort of content. They want the same content that they grew up with. Yes, you can make it responsibly. Not everything. This association with sexiness and degrading a certain group is completely, in my opinion, overstated. And, there's been very few instances of that. You can still have an awesome Mortal Kombat game with females that are, female characters that look, sexy, hot, and awesome. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I wish Western developers would start to understand, or start, to get that like that's who your audience still is. Then maybe you wouldn't have such colossal disasters as Suicide Squad kills the Justice League. And again, of course, this is not really like the only issue that is, causing so many games to fail. But if I look at all the games that have failed, the one thing that most of them have all gotten wrong is the aesthetics. The aesthetic is completely off and it's really unappealing. Doesn't mean that if your game has, a less conventionally appealing aesthetic, it's going to fail. We've seen it a lot with other games. If your game, like for instance, Last of Us 2, very successful game, but as I said, to me, it's one of the games that made me feel so uncomfortable. And that was, I think, what the developers intended, is to make you feel uncomfortable. But you can't make that your your every game. Another example would be God of War. God of War used to be edgy, violent, over the top, and aesthetically very, very appealing. And I think we've lost a lot of that. It's become a much more subdued game when it comes to those aspects. But for some reason, a lot of these developers don't have a problem with the violent content, as if violence is somehow not as harmful as, or it's less harmful than aesthetics. And I don't know where that comes from. I honestly do not know where that comes from. But anyways, just my thoughts. And I'm hoping that in the future, when they make games like a Suicide Squad, they'll put that into consideration, that a lot of these characters are still targeted at a largely male audience, and it's a largely male audience that just wants to have a good time, that doesn't want every single one of their games to be a thought-provoking thought experiment about a deep narrative, exploring, central themes about society and that. If I want that, I will go out and I'll pursue and I'll look for that. I don't want each and every one of my games to be like that. In conclusion, I would say a lot of this also has to do with what we support as gamers. Start supporting the games that you believe represent the things that are important to you. So guys, thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like, a comment, and subscribe. And yeah, hope to see you next time.